And for the next 40 minutes, we're going to be addressing mobilizing the finance to fight climate change. Mobilizing finance, so critical in the ways that I underscored right at the start. Let me introduce those who have joined me on the platform at this early hour in Govan. First of all, Kate Forbes, MSP, who's Cabinet Secretary for Finance and the Economy in the Scottish Government. Welcome. Stephen Guilbeault, welcome, Stephen. Minister for Environment and Climate Change in Canada. You've been in the job for 2 weeks. But you were a long-standing Greenpeace activist, and you've had other things which you've been involved in. It's your 19th COP, I think you told me last week. Bjorn Sibben, who's President for European Markets for NASDAQ. Welcome, Bjorn. Dr. Linda Elling-Lee, Managing Director and Global Head of ESG and Climate Research at MSCI, and Bernice, nice to see you again, Bernice van Bronkhorst, who's Global Director for Climate Change at the World Bank. So much is moving so fast. What I'd like to ask each of you is what your audit is after the first week. I mentioned, maybe you weren't here when I said it at the beginning, but Mark Carney says there's enough money. There's 130 trillion. The question is how we replumb and rewire it all. Bjorn, can I come to you first? Literally just headline stuff for the moment.
Yes. Do you hear me well? Yes, perfect. Good morning. Great to be here. So first of all, it has been great to see all the work that has been done before COP26. Also all the work that has been done during COP26, and of course what is important is also the action that we will see post these weeks. What I like to stress is that I have been impressed with all the work and also the commitment that we've seen from the private sector. The private sector will not be able to solve all the problems. It has to be a combination between public and private sectors. But the commitment, the effort, we heard it from the CEO from BMW, that you have clear goals, that you measure, and you commit, and it's something that will be measured on also going forward has been important. And it's also great to see that the financial sector are present here much more than we have seen in the past. I think this is also a great signal.
But are you sitting here on a Monday morning saying, we achieved a lot last week, there's much more to achieve, but we're moving in the right direction?
Yes, spot on.
All right, excellent. Let's see if there's consensus on the platform. Linda.
Absolutely. Can you hear me? All right. I have to say that I think that the declarations that were made on Finance Day, those were not easy pledges, I think, for these institutions to make. And that is because today, the $130 trillion is actually invested in an economy that is not actually aligned with anywhere close to 1.5 degrees Celsius rise. And so I think that those pledges were big numbers, and I think they're going to be difficult to fulfill. But I think that the will is there. I think there's been a lot of talk about political will among our policymakers. I definitely think in private finance, what we're seeing is that the will is definitely there, and right now we have to find the way. And I think that the way will involve looking at gaps in the data that we need and new measurements that we need in order to actually make investment decisions that can help allocate and reallocate the capital towards a net zero economy.
How big are those gaps in data?
Oh, it is actually tremendous. I mean, when we talk about maybe the biggest companies in the world, so the public listed companies in the world that are very prominent parts of the investment portfolio, you know, what we're really looking at is that there are only about 10% of companies that are currently on an emissions trajectory that would keep us under 1.5 degrees. And in fact, only about 15% of all companies have even made decarbonization commitments. So what we're talking about is a huge parts of the economy and companies that have not actually even measured their full emissions footprint, let alone try to make commitments to decarbonize. So, you know, we are talking about a very substantial amount of work that will need to be done very, very quickly because collectively, the world's public companies are actually going to burn through their budget for 1.5 degrees in the next 5 years.
Bernice, your quick assessment.
First week, I would say maybe glass half full so far. I think there's still a bit of a push to go in the next week. I think it's also, of course, true that a lot of the work that happens at the COP has really all been, you know, prepared, and a lot of work goes into in the lead up to COP. And
but that's important.
It's incredibly important, and I think that what you're seeing this last week, all the announcements, the increased ambition, the fact that we have the US back at the table, hugely important, of course, for global climate action. I think that is really reflecting just a huge amount of work that has gone in the months leading up to COP, and big congratulations also to, to the UK government, to the COP presidency. But from where I'm sitting as a development institution, of course, there's a lot of emphasis on the 100 billion and the fact that we're still struggling to get to the 100 billion, and we're now hopefully getting there by 2023. Good signs. But what is really exciting and what has been really exciting is just to see the interest and the real seriousness of the private sector coming into this space. And that is fundamentally different from what we saw even just 2-3 years ago. And that is what's going to make the difference. And as we were discussing, the billions to trillions, it has to be that private sector participation in all of this. So I think that's a really, really encouraging sign.
And the glass is filling. You talked about a glass.
I think the glass
is
filling
fast.
It's filling fast, absolutely.
Stephen Guilbeault.
Well, I think it would have been difficult to get an agreement in Glasgow without this roadmap on the $100 billion. I was there in Copenhagen when it was a very messy agreement. In fact, it wasn't a negotiated agreement as part of the UN process in Copenhagen. It was a last attempt to try and salvage what had been and what is considered to be a very difficult COP. And for 10 years, we made some progress, but obviously, industrialized countries like mine and others, we have not delivered on that $100 billion commitment. And I mean, this process runs on a few currency, but one of them is trust. And countries need to know that those who make commitments will make good on them, which is why getting this agreement was so important, and we have it now. We have the roadmap. We'll get there in 2023, maybe even 2022. Developing countries will see that the money is going to be there. We're talking about $600 billion all the way past 2025. That's great, but that's not enough. And we need to find ways to scale up what needs to be done in ways we've never done before. We can't think that we're going to solve this and help developing countries face the impacts of climate change. There needs to be more done on adaptation, but we can't do that project by project. We have to find ways of transforming entire sectors of nations' economies, energy sector, building, transportation, agriculture, and we will need a very heavy involvement of countries like mine, and Canada doubled its climate pledge financing in the lead up to Glasgow, and many other countries did as well. But the role of the multilateral institutions will be super important, because that's how there are a few countries who tend to do things directly, but most of our countries do it through the multilaterals.
Kate, let me come to you next. What's your assessment?
I think my answer is yes, but ...
What is the but?
In other words, we knew that this COP would be measured on the basis of its tangible actions that emerge from it. And we started knowing what the objectives were, keep 1.5 in sight, and the fact that 85% of the finance required to deliver that needs to come from the private sector. And that's why I think last week's announcement is tremendous. But as a politician, you'll forgive me for being an expert and making announcements and sometimes struggling to deliver. Certainly that's what the electorate tell me. So I think the real measure of this will be whether or not there's accountability and scrutiny for the delivery, because it's not sufficient to have identified funds, you must deliver. And it's not just sufficient to deliver them in any way possible. They must be delivered in a way that delivers a tangible and meaningful outcomes. So I think for me that's the next step, is how over the next week can we move beyond the high-level announcement and make sure that there's a means of deploying finance in a way that will make the biggest difference.
Let me just underscore, those of you who just arrived, please use your app. Send me questions, send me thoughts, send me observations. This is the most efficient way of getting thoughts to the panel. Let me, and you can do that through the app. Let me just put to you the challenge here. What do you think is meant by Mark Carney saying we need to change the plumbing and we need to rewire the system? I mean, rewiring the financial system at the kind of speed needed to challenge climate change and to actually embrace the emergency is an enormous challenge. But what does he mean by, do you think, plumbing? And what does Rishi Sunak, the British Chancellor of the Exchequer, mean by rewiring? What needs to be done and how quickly can it be done? Bjorn?
So I agree we need to change the plumbing, but I think what is important here is that...
But what does that mean? What does that mean, do you think?
I think we need to change the focus. I think I represent the financial markets, and as an exchange, we are a key part of that. If you look at what we do, we provide capital to companies that want to do sustainable investments. We provide finance to small entrepreneurs that want to do innovation, to get capital for innovation and sustainable solutions. And we combine investors with those who need capital. So investors that want to put their money into sustainable investments, whether it's retail investors or big institutional corporates. And I think actually using the financial markets as a key to finance the sustainable solutions is important here. And I think that's a key part of the change that we're seeing. See that more and more institutional investors, they want to invest in sustainable solutions. They can do that through the financial markets. So the financial market will play a more important part, have committed to that, and we'll see that will be a clear demand. And one more part that is important, I think you mentioned the point about something that needs to be measurable. I think what is important here is that many of the actions that the many private companies have committed to with high ambitions need to be measurable. So the fact that you use financial markets that are transparent, where it's easy to measure, is central here. So that you use the financial markets to do the investments in something that is measurable, that is clear, and something that everybody, investors, corporates, can see and measure is important.
Linda, help us understand what you think needs to be done for replumbing and rewiring. It sounds like the house is sort of being rebuilt. It sounds like a retrofit going on here.
Yes, absolutely. So, MSCI is a founding member of the Glasgow under GFANZ, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. We are a financial service provider that is also committed to net zero.
And are you impressed by what's been achieved by GFANZ? Are you impressed by what's been achieved by GFANZ?
I think it's been, I'm impressed by how much capital has been committed to align with net zero. And so along with other index providers and credit rating agencies and exchanges and so forth, we are also committed to essentially rebuild some of that market infrastructure to be able to channel capital to help the world's investors and banks channel capital towards net zero. So let me give you an example. I think that in terms of changing some of the basic infrastructure, some of the basic tools, today, the way investors allocate money is based on financial metrics. That's what they're used to, and that is how you actually make comparisons. But what we really need are, of course, climate exposure data and climate exposure metrics that can actually help you make decisions about how to reallocate your capital towards climate solutions. Now, what investors have to work with today are actually mainly carbon emissions information from companies, and that has two problems. One is that it's got a lot of gaps. There's no mandatory disclosure. There's no standardized disclosure. So, companies like ourselves, which is the largest provider of climate and ESG data and analytics to the world's largest investors, we really have to spend a lot of time cleaning that data, standardizing that data, and making it useful. Now, there's still another problem, which is that carbon emissions is actually backwards-looking data. It tells you what businesses are doing yesterday, right? It doesn't tell you what they're going to be doing in the next 5, 10, and 30 years that are so incredibly critical. And so the financial services industry that provides a lot of these tools and data, including ourselves, are today in actually a very experimental and innovative phase in trying to develop forward-looking metrics and forward-looking measures that can actually help investors make capital allocation decisions that are aligned with a net zero economy. And so what that means is, for example, we need to be able to project, and we have been projecting companies' emissions over the next 10, 30, 50 years, and comparing that to what kind of a emissions budget that they have for staying under 1.5 degrees.
Can you do that with certainty? Project 10 to 15 years?
We can project what companies are intending to do over the next 5, 10, 30 years, and that would include their decarbonization targets. However, the data is imperfect, right? We can only make sort of the best proxies that we can. However, we can actually see, if any specific company that is over their budget, if the entire planet were over budget in the same way that they are aligned with, for example, a 2.5 degree world or a 4+ degree world. And that kind of forward-looking measure is actually what investors are going to need as part of a larger new information set that they're going to need in order to make capital allocations decisions that is aligned with a net zero economy.
Bernice, plumbing and rewiring.
I mean, from a perspective of developing countries, I think first of all, everything that's been said, I fully agree with. We need standards, we need taxonomies, we need to ensure that, that private capital is really not being greenwashed, but is going to the actual things that we want them to go to. Having said that, I am a little concerned that for many of our, particularly our poorest clients, some of this can be very difficult. There's a lack of capacity, there's a lack of data, as you mentioned. So there is a risk that the capital will go to, high capacity countries, programs in rich countries, and there may be a perverse impact that you actually see smaller flows going to developing countries. Who's going to invest in the Malawi, in the Gabon, in the Ghana, where you do not necessarily have that kind of capacity? So that's something that we really need to work on. That's a big role for us as the multilateral development banks, is to work with developing countries to build that capacity, to build that understanding, to make sure the regulatory frameworks are put in place so that we can attract that private capital. So that's one. The second piece of it, I think, is also really, really critical, is for developing countries, is the whole question around de-risking. We hear a lot about the trillions, right? Trillions of dollars. But when it, push comes to shove, who's actually going to take the risk of investing in, risky projects in an emerging market or in a fragile country? Again, looking at many of our client countries, say in sub-Saharan Africa. So it's, again, how do we figure out how we can de-risk? What is the role of the World Bank or in other multilaterals there, so that we can provide some level of comfort? I think some of the risk will also have to be taken on by the financial markets themselves, and not just assume that the multilaterals will come in and assume all of that risk. But that's the kind of big plumbing reforms or replumbing that we're going to need over the next.
Stephen
few
Guilbeault,
years.
you were nodding.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And in fact, it's not a risk. Looking at the CDM track record of where projects went, we know that the vast majority of projects went to China, and smaller countries, including in Africa, got very little of that CDM money. So if the past tells us nothing, is that we have to change the rules of the games, because otherwise, if left to what it is, the market will go to where it's safer. Both from and you spoke about, in some cases, political challenges, but it could also be technological challenges. Everyone wants to do wind and solar now. It's predictable, it's cheap, we know it works, but it's great. I was talking to an investor just before coming here, a large institutional investor, who was telling me, we have money, but we're looking for projects to do. There aren't enough projects. So I think that's one of the things Mr. Carney was talking about in terms of the pipeline, and that's what I meant when I was talking about the scale of investment that needs to happen, and the rapidity at which those investments need to be deployed. And the private sector won't invest in capacity building. So it's up to us, governments, multilateral institutions, to ensure that we build capacity in those places where it's most needed, to ensure that projects can flow there and that they can flow there rapidly.
Looking for projects, what specificity do they want to make a project investable?
Well, they're the private sector, so they're looking for good returns, and they're looking for projects. They want some de-risking. Now, obviously, they're in the private sector, so they should be willing and capable of living with some level of risk, but that's where we need to step in to make sure that we find this right balance where we are taking some of the risk, they're taking some of the risk, but if the analysis that they do is that these projects are too risky, they simply won't happen.
Kate.
I mean, this is precisely the point I was making earlier, that having announced funding, unless that funding can find a home with viable, deliverable propositions, then it just remains as an announcement. And this is the huge challenge. And I think there are great risks in terms of deploying that capital, that it's done in a relatively unjust fashion. So we talk at length about a just transition. And if the most viable, deliverable propositions are also ones that, for example, disenfranchise people and displace people, then do we count that as a success or not? And I think the two solutions, just briefly, in terms of how we de-risk, is one, partnering with internationally public capital. So when it comes to whether it's Stephen's country of Canada, my country of Scotland with our Climate Justice Fund, we can often identify the local partners to work collaboratively with and perhaps open up opportunities and de-risk that. And then the other one is what Bernice talked about in terms of development banks. So ensuring that there's the capability, the capacity when it comes to local development banks, again, to aid the search as investors look for deliverable, viable propositions. But I just finish with that point that yes, we need plumbing in terms of the data, the scrutiny, the accountability, the measurements, but I think we also need plumbing in terms of values. What does investing for a just transition actually look like, rather than just investing in viable, deliverable propositions that deliver a good return?
Just to be clear, Linda, can you actually specify values in data? Is that possible to do?
I was about to comment on that. I think that we need to be very holistic about these metrics, right? So the reason there has been this movement around integrating environmental, social, and governance factors in the investment process is to try to capture some of those elements so that you're not only prioritizing certain metrics while hiding other ones that might be detrimental, for example, on some of the social impacts. So, you know, it's obviously not an easy place to be, and it's also difficult to standardize. However, you know, I think that there is a lot of interest in it, and we're continuing to kind of build on that. I would also say that another area that was very exciting this week is the pledges around deforestation. That is going to be another area where data and metrics are actually very challenging at the moment, more so than for climate action, I would say, or for climate mitigation.
But geospatial stuff can produce enormous amounts of data now on deforestation.
It can, but it cannot capture everything, and it certainly can't capture some of the justice issues that was just spoken about. So it has to be holistic, right? And so it cannot just be that it's about, you know, capturing kind of data from satellites and so forth, because you're going to be missing a lot of things,
All right.
and a lot of the qualitative
I'm getting a lot of
differences that
questions. We have 20 minutes to run, so keep your remarks accordingly. Bjorn and then
Yes,
Bernice.
so we run exchanges both in US and in Europe. One of the key challenges for many of the listed companies, and they have high ambitions, many of them have set ambitions of being carbon neutral in year X. So clear ambitions, it's a key part of their strategy. If you talk to some of those companies, that was not a key part of their strategy 3 years ago. So the mindset have changed. The challenge for many of the listed companies is, how do I report? There are so many reporting standards. How do we measure? So I think that's the journey we have to be on. And on the investment side, if you are an institutional investor and want to invest in sustainable bonds, it's difficult to find data, gather the data. What we try to do is gather data from all the sustainable bonds around the world to put it out there so you as an investor can find, measure the different sustainable bonds that you want to invest in, so to make it more accessible and easier to measure. So I think the key part is the ambitions are there. We need to be better to measure, and also on the reporting side, it is so difficult for the many companies that has high ambitions to actually report on it, because the way you measure and the way you look at it is so different across the globe.
Bernice and then Stephen.
No, I really just wanted to comment on your reforestation piece, and I just want to agree that we have so much new technology these days, makes it so much easier. So there are some things that are actually much easier. We used to have to send people into forest to walk around, to measure circumference of tree trunks, etc. Right now we have ways for satellites, drones, etc. to go in, and you can get pretty accurate measurements of what's happening on the ground. So I think there are ways that we can get better data, but I think what is really key is that we need to come up with a framework that everyone agrees to. Something that is not dumbed down, but at the same time is something that is not that so complicated and so difficult to implement that the countries that we would really like to support...
microphone's just gone.
My
Okay.
microphone just died.
Keep talking, but...
So that we ensure that those countries can also report on these kinds of data points. Otherwise, again, the risk is that the money flows to away from them as opposed to
Guilbeault.
them.
Forestry, hugely challenging. Canada, a quarter of the world's boreal forest. We're still having expert debates in Canada about forestry accounting issues. So if it's the case for a G7 country, we can imagine how challenging it will be in many countries. Second, I think that central agencies, like our central banks in many of our countries, can play an important role in standardizing some of the reporting, transparency, stress testing for companies' exposure to climate risk. And just last week, in fact, I was very happy to see, no merits to me, but the Bank of Canada announced that they were going to do exactly that. And we need more of our central institutions to get on board with that.
You have vast amounts of forest. We're talking about forest at the moment. Can you know what's happening out in the tundra, Stephen?
Well, I think you're right. Technology is going to help us, but there are hugely complex accounting methodologies, issues that need to be resolved, and the IPCC has been working on that for a very long time. But it would be wrong to think that this issue is solved, because it's not.
All right. Now, a lot of questions. Please keep the questions coming in, whether you're here in Glasgow or whether you're somewhere around the world. And in fact, I have a message here from a frustrated Australian, Bernice, who says, do you think that investors will influence governments that are lagging, missing out on potential investment in key transitions? Who'd like to come in on that? Investors.
Well, okay.
No, I just missed could you, the latter part of the question.
Do you think that investors will influence governments that are lagging, missing out on potential investment in key transitions?
I think yes and no, but I don't think it's inevitable. So I think it really depends on where you're based and what the frameworks are already in that country. So, for example, in Scotland, that's probably a message that we hear, and so we've responded with a green investment portfolio to make it easier for investors to find those viable, deliverable propositions. But I think that in perhaps some other parts of the world, we need to go in and work locally with partners on the ground to develop and deliver those viable propositions. So I think the investors saying there's $130 trillion here is not in and of itself sufficient to find the right investable propositions. And I think there's a huge amount of work that needs to be done by development banks and others on the ground locally to identify them, to ensure. And I think we need to do that work up front. So at the moment, if we do not do that, then that $130 trillion will find a home, we hope. Most of it will, but it may not be in the countries that need it the most.
Can you imagine what $130 trillion is like?
Huge.
I can't.
Bigger than huge.
I agree with Kate in terms of the quality of what needs to happen, but both in terms of social and environmental impact. But if 10 years ago, someone would have told me that we would be having a conversations about hundreds of billions, thousands of billions of dollars to be invested to fight climate change, I would not have believed it. It is, what we're seeing is a tectonic shift. And getting the money to the table is one thing, spending it wisely is certainly, and fast enough to meet the challenge of climate change is another one. But the answer to the question is yes, and they already are. The fact that investors would come and see me and say, help us spend that money. Make sure we have the proper rules and regulations, make sure that you help us de-risk, help us find projects, work with the World Bank to ensure that this can be deployed. I would like to think that Canada is no longer a laggard when it comes to these things. So I think that the private sector is influencing governments positively, but again, we need to make sure that it's done right.
Bjorn, do you think that's happening? And Linda as well, quickly.
Yes, it is happening. What I just want to highlight, and when we talk about the challenges around forestry, there are other ways that you can be carbon neutral and commit to that. We are part of building a market where you can actually remove carbon from the atmosphere. And that's a nascent industry, but innovation will solve a lot of things, and the financial sector will play a key part of that. So can we build market solutions where it is transparent, where you can actually go ahead and even trade carbon removable, so you actually remove carbon from the atmosphere? Innovation will be a part of solving that.
But the influence of investors on governments?
Yes, but investors have huge impact on the governments and of course also many of the listed companies. So they have massive impact and they are using that.
Linda?
So I think that the one way that investors have already had an influence on governments is really around this whole standard setting, all right? And I think that there are movements to have mandatory reporting, to have stress testing and so forth. It's because the private capital markets really actually need that standardization from governments. It's not something that everyone can do kind of individually. So I think that's already happening. Now, I think that in terms of actually reallocating huge amounts of capital, this $130 trillion. The reason I think that a lot of the institutional investors are going to you seeking these projects is that there is a realization that we're about to undergo a huge transformation in our economy, right? And I don't think that private sector and institutional investors are actually waiting for governments. I mean, what they're looking at is, if we reflect today, among the 10 largest public companies today, 7 of them didn't actually exist 30 years ago. So 30 years from now, I think that we're going to have totally different set of players that could be dominating the market, and I think investors want to be in on it. Whenever there's a huge market transformation, the market players are either motivated by fear or by greed, and right now I think there is going to be more greed because people want to be that investor that invests in that invention for climate solutions and for new markets that don't exist yet that are going to be sustainable and going to be at the top of the market in 2050. So I do really feel like that's why investors are actually seeking new opportunities. I don't know that they're waiting necessarily, but certainly some clear policy signals that are consistent would be very helpful.
Well, let me keep driving this forward. A comment here from CMA Naya, a strategy consultant. Is not the risk of investors going to developed nations really leaving the developing nations in difficulty? I'll leave that for you to comment on if you want. And Jumana Salahin, I think I'm pushing this, Jumana. It feels like it's going to take a long time to replumb and rewire. So bear in mind for the last 15 minutes, how can we potentially speed this process up? But let me put a couple of more specific points. Peter Craven, how do we really unite values to create the enduring culture that's now required? I mean, I'm very struck by Steve Waygood of Aviva Investors, who said he's seen more progress in the last 12 months than he's seen in 22 years in this whole area. And he's been very deeply involved in TCFD and so on. And that's just one quote. But changing the culture, changing mindsets as well. Your views, please. Bernice.
Well, we've taken the approach that to change minds, and we, for example, work with a lot of ministers of finance, and it's been a really difficult discussion traditionally to really talk about climate and the climate risks and impacts, but also opportunities of ministries of finance. They think this is something that ministers of environment do. So bringing it into that space, I think we need the foundational pieces. We need really just very good analytics. So, we're doing at each country level, we're doing what we call these country climate and development reports, really starting to understand what are the climate risks that a country is facing, what are the transition risks the country is facing, what are your contribution as a country to global emissions profiles, but also what are your opportunities? What are the green jobs that you could be bringing? How can you do your just transition? How can you unleash some of that private capital investment that you could potentially bring in? So it's really about, I think, getting down, having really good analytics, really understanding country-specific, contexts, what the risks are, what the opportunities are, and then really, I think that is the first, the foundational piece for us to then be able to move much faster in terms of regulatory reform, standard setting, et cetera, because you need to get the buy-in for that.
Stephen, can I come to you? Because for 20 years, you were actually an environmental activist. This is the 19th COP, but not as a politician. And you've only been environment minister for 2 weeks. You were 2 years minister for heritage, and you only became a politician 2 years ago. But you have a very significant reputation as an activist. What are you seeing coming in from outside about the ability of a country like Canada to adapt, for public servants to adapt, for mindsets to change? You're a member of the cabinet. You've just been through an election. I'm asking you this because are you feeling you're challenged to get people to think differently, or they're really willing to think differently within a ministry?
For a long time, as an activist, I have said we have to stop thinking of climate change as an environmental issue. And we have to stop thinking that it's up to the environment minister, no matter how competent they may be, to solve this. We have to bring in our financial colleagues and Treasury Board and innovation, economic development. Otherwise, it won't happen. And not just at the political level, but also at departmental level as well. Everyone needs to feel in government that this is their issue. It's not just a green people, not just the environment and climate change minister. And one of the innovation that Prime Minister Trudeau did in the previous mandate was to put in every single cabinet minister's mandate letter, the instructions that the Prime Minister gives to his ministers, that climate change is about you, every single one of them. So that really changes the nature of the conversation. It shifts the burden from what it has been only in one ministry and one minister to the fact that now everyone needs to be involved. And I think that's one key. It may not be the only one, but it's a really important one. And having someone like Kate here, who does not only finance and economic development, we need to bring our finance ministers more to these meetings and on these panels and meeting these people and hearing what we're hearing, what I have been hearing for 25 years. They need to hear that too.
Kate, what's the political reality you're facing in answer to Peter Craven's question? How you unite values to create the enduring culture required within government?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there are three angles to this collaboration that's required. And we've already heard one in terms of financial markets and financial institutions working together. But then there's the public, the private. But then critically, there is also governments across the world agreeing on frameworks. And I know I sound like a broken record, but I keep coming back to this point around just transition. It's one of those phrases, those pieces of jargon that we're now just deploying as though everybody knows what it means. What does justice mean? What does justice mean when it comes to investments? What does justice mean when it comes to governments making policy decisions? And we are a member of the Under 2 Coalition, which is state actors below the national government. In other words, regions, cities own huge amounts of infrastructure and will be critical when it comes to the fight against climate change. You need them involved as well, and we need to come to a settled agreement on what justice means. Is it investment when it comes to mitigating climate change at all costs, in other words, whilst also disenfranchising people, or is there a means for taking people with us? And that is just a loose, woolly phrase unless you've got the concrete frameworks that are recognised by markets and by institutions.
Bjorn, you wanted to come in?
Just want to say that we should remember that this is a journey. When we spoke to many listed companies 3 years ago, not all of them had a clear ESG strategy. All of them have now. It's a key part.
All of them?
All of them have that. That's a key part of their focus. And many of them, they lose out on investment dollars if they do not have a clear strategy, a clear signal that they send to the investment community. On top of that, most retail investors are actually willing to a lower return if they invest in a company that has a sustainable profile. So it's not always, when it comes to investors, about return here and now. They are actually willing to sacrifice some of that for investing in a company that has a sustainable profile.
There is clear data on that, is there?
There is clear data that retail investors are willing to sacrifice some of their return for investing in sustainable companies in the future.
Linda, one for you, I think. How can the countries, this from Pradeep, Epan, Matthew, how can the countries and companies that are not disclosing important climate data be made to report such data?
So I will definitely answer that, but I want to come in on this cultural mind shift point. I do think that it's already happening with companies and investors, and I think the reason is because of the public sentiment, honestly. I think that society is holding companies to much higher standards, and there's much greater transparency and demands for transparency for what it is that companies are actually doing, right? And so even today, you can go and look up, many companies. You can go to our website, and you can see what the carbon footprints of companies are, what they have reported, what they have not reported, what is the gender diversity of their workforce and their boards. There's so many of these kind of metrics that companies are now having to be accountable for, and so I do think that previous writer's question about culture mindset, that is happening because companies are forced to actually adopt that. Now to this question about emissions, is that the question?
Yes.
Country, okay, yes. Companies and countries. Well, I absolutely think that we need to have some mandatory reporting of some of the core metrics because we really need to have a full accounting of the emissions footprints of companies. We need to know where their facilities are located, their largest ones, so we can actually do proper climate risk and analytics on these companies. And I do think that has to happen, at a policy level. This is no longer a voluntary scheme where companies can report whatever they feel like is material for themselves. Rather than what investors all need to know and what the public needs to know. So I think some mandatory reporting is super important because we need those raw ingredients. There is no next generation climate analytics or anything if we don't have those raw ingredients, which we're really missing today.
All right, I've got 5 minutes left and at least 2 questions I want to get out at the moment. Picking up on that issue of plenty of money but lack of suitable projects. This from Christian Fauduc. One of the issues, though, is the focus on large corporations forgetting about mechanisms to enable funding and financing of SME-driven, decentralized projects. Kate.
Absolutely. I think that's a super question because, again, so if I take the Scottish context, which I know will not be the same everywhere, but we've just established the Scottish National Investment Bank, which is a mission-led bank looking at how we leverage, crowd in, catalyse long-term private investment for our climate change ambitions. And one of the fascinating things is how they can identify smaller supply chains, the SME base, and bring them to the attention to international investors. Now, that's where I think those trusted partners on the ground will be essential. And there are huge opportunities. And I think countries need to be clear on what their long-term objectives are, what the mechanisms are, and ensure that those mechanisms can tap into, whether it's $130 trillion or other investment funds that are available. We have the opportunity to do that. Again, I know I keep coming back to this. It's not inevitable. I think it needs to be a choice, and that's where the public-private partnership is so key, and where I guess that money being available is great. The investors have done their side of the bargain. Now it's up to governments and policy-led public sector to work with them to ensure that the money gets to the projects that need it the most.
And let me pick this up from Kin McCann, Head of Sustainability and Global Industrial Manufacturing at PA Consulting. How do we get finance in place for new early-stage technologies where the business model is yet to be proven or will only work at scale? In other words, risk. Bernice.
Well, I think this is one area that the MDBs certainly have a big role to play. And I think, a big example is solar. I think, 10 years ago, solar energy, there was a lot of investment coming in from the multilateral development banks, again, de-risking. It was still expensive, it was unknown, it wasn't clear you could do it at scale. And that then sort of led to a situation today where it's on par or actually, it's cheaper than most other sources of energy. And it's become, absolutely no reason anymore for the multilaterals to be funding, solar parks in most places of the world. And that is because, the sort of first mover, I think, impact 10 years ago. And I think there are other technologies, other things that absolutely there's a role for the public banks, in the north, but certainly the multilateral development banks in the south.
Well, on top of being an activist, I was also an advisor for 10 years for a venture capital fund dedicated to clean technologies. And I think it is the role of government working in collaboration with private sector to fund these early initiatives, these new technologies, because big banks won't go there until they know it's safe. Large investors won't tend to go there until they know from a financial point of view it's safe. So it's our role, some of us working together to ensure that we are funding the solar and wind of tomorrow, certainly in the transportation sector, ag sector. There's lots of work that needs to be done there. Buildings, energy in a way, it's perhaps one of the easiest of the sector we have to tackle.
Literally 30 seconds, Bjorn.
Yes, and that's where the financial markets plays an important role. Yes, you need funding for some of the innovation, some of the off-start, but then what is really important is to get scalability, and that's where you use the public markets. That's where you list on the exchange to get further access to capital to grow your small niche innovation business globally and get scalability. So I think that's where public and private work so well together, where you actually get access to capital from the public markets to grow bigger and get the scalability, and that's where you really get the impact on sustainability.
I'm really reluctant to bring this to a close. I have more questions here, but we've got through an enormous amount in just 40 minutes. So look, can I thank you enormously for getting here early, stimulating a discussion from 8:01. So thank you very much, Kate, Stephen, Bjorn, Linda, and Bernice. Much appreciated. You've set a very clear baseline for showing that there is movement, and it's moving in the right direction at speed. Thank you. For those of you who weren't here right at the beginning, I've said that we're going to be driving this at some speed, and it's going to be pretty relentless. But we want to make sure you have a lot of good information, and there are literally 40,000 people registered around the world watching this as well. So don't think it's just confined to this tent in Govan on the south side of the Clyde.